Everyone. Thanks, Marguerite. This is the Local Government Financial Resources Choose Your Adventure Part 2 webinar. My name is Chantal Unfug. I'm the Director for the Division of Local Government in DOLA, and we're so glad you're joining us for this second round. I know everybody feels like we're all together in this and we're all building the airplane as it flies, and so these kind of opportunities for getting together and ask the questions and go through the information is really important. And we know that the guidance from the federal government changes every once in a while, and so we're all on our toes watching that. We wanted to make sure you all had the information you needed. So as you know, on July 2nd, we hosted a webinar, Choosing Your Adventure Part 1, with the purpose of helping you navigate the many financial resources available across state agencies that are in on this complex adventure with you. Since then, we've continued to respond to a number of questions, specifically about the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Funds, which, as we all know, need to be spent down by the end of this calendar year. And we all know that these programs have multiple state and federal resources, all with different kinds of eligibility requirements, training needs, award processes, and timing. So we want to be there to answer your questions and have those strategic conversations so you can get the money as efficiently as possible and use the money as strategically as possible so we don't leave money on the table. I know none of us want to see that. So I want to just make sure I mention gratefulness and the thankfulness for the cross-departmental collaboration with OSPB and the DOLA team today. Ashley's on from the OSPB, and she's been working so hard with all of us to try to get this as streamlined as possible. So we're all reviewing and approving the requests that we already have coming in and preparing for today. So this is going to be jam-packed, so I am going to turn it over to Marguerite and we will get going. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chantal, and welcome, everyone. As Chantal said, I'm Marguerite Harden. I'm with the Colorado Resiliency Office. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the CRO, we are also housed within the Division of Local Government at DOLA, and we provide support to local communities around resiliency and long-term recovery. Even when there isn't a global pandemic, the CRO seeks to assess and understand and mitigate shocks and stresses throughout our state so that our communities can be more prepared, resilient, we can recover faster, and even rebuild stronger and more equitably. So this webinar is being recorded, and it will also be posted at the link you see here, which I'm going to drop into the chat. And in fact, this webinar is part of a full series. So if we can advance to the next slide. So there are 6 other webinars that are up on that website that are recorded. And for example, this first one that we hosted in May is on setting up local recovery and resiliency teams. You can also watch a recorded episode of budgeting strategies, which we hosted in June. There's a Choose Your Own Adventure, which was part 1 of this conversation, which was more broadly focused around other funding sources. And we also did a webinar on identifying current impacts and future needs. So the whole series generally is called the Adaptations and Future Webinar Series, and together these presentations provide a suite of timely and actionable information for our local governments as we navigate the response, recovery, and long-term adaptations to COVID. So while this conversation is really specific to coronavirus relief funds, we hope that the guidance in these webinars help you to think strategically and not just about project eligibility, but how you can approach COVID with a strong and coordinated team and with the tools to help you understand your community needs, how to do it equitably, and so forth. So without further ado, if we could advance, great. This is our agenda for today. We're going to start off with Ashley Clark from OSPB on a more regulatory perspective of the CVRF funds. And then we're going to be moving into more specific eligibility criteria led by Tamara and Chris from the Department of Local Affairs. And importantly, we are hoping to have about 15 minutes of questions at the end. I'm encouraging you to put your questions in as early as you can because we do have a team in the back that's going to be trying to best prepare answers to these questions. We encourage you to also think broadly about how your question may be applicable to other Colorado communities and not just your own. And questions that do require specific research into Treasury Guidance will be answered and sent out via email and posted on the CRR website along with the recording of this webinar. So we're going to try to get to everything, but obviously there are some things we just might not have an answer to or might require more research. So feel free to use that question and answer panel in your chat. Otherwise, you are muted. And if we can advance one more slide. These are pictures of each of our presenters because we won't be using video. So we hope that you get to know each presenter. The reason we're not using video is just to try to save Wi-Fi bandwidth for everyone. But let's kick it off now with Ashley Clark from OSPB.
Thank you for that. Next slide. My name is Ashley Clark, and I'm here to talk to you at a high level about the federal stimulus funds and the CARES Act funds from a regulatory perspective. As you may know, Colorado has received more than $19 billion of federal stimulus funding so far due to the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please. The federal government has enacted 4 different stimulus packages and is making funding available through federal agencies, including FEMA. So far, Colorado has received $19 billion federal stimulus. The vast majority of that aid has flowed to businesses and individuals, including more than $10 billion through the Paycheck Protection Program, $4 billion in direct payments to individuals, and $1 billion in expanded and extended unemployment insurance. Hospitals in Colorado have also received nearly $1 billion from the HHS Provider Relief Fund. However, this data is incomplete and the total funding for hospitals might be higher. The CARES Act also allocated funds to state and local governments. Next slide, please. Of the $3 billion in state funds, over $1.7 billion was CARES Act Title V coronavirus relief funds, which we're here to talk about today. Next slide, please. Of the available CRF funds, $560 million were allocated directly from the federal government to larger local jurisdictions in Colorado. The remaining $1.7 billion was distributed custodially through a partnership with the governor and the legislative leadership. $275 million was allocated to local jurisdictions. $450 million was distributed to institutions of higher education, and $547 million was distributed to our public school systems for expenses to respond to the pandemic and as a provision of economic support. An additional $70 million was appropriated by the legislature. Next slide, please. However, we all know that the money previously allocated is not enough. We know that the state needs more to fund important county and local services, such as issues near and dear to my own heart, child welfare. Counties and locals need more to address the serious issues going on in our communities and around the state, particularly in our rural and underserved areas. That is why we at the governor's office are fighting for you. Next slide, please. How are we fighting for you? The governor's office is constantly fighting for local governments and funding behind the scenes. We have emphasized time and time again the need for more state and local aid. We've hammered home the importance of increased revenue streams in areas fundamental to government functions, such as economic security, childcare, education, healthcare, housing, clean energy, environment, natural resources, and agriculture. These are important issues across the state. In addition, we're compiling and amplifying information you provided DOLA. Just last week, Secretary Mnuchin was on a call with the governor and was asked if we could estimate the needs to the state. We told him later that night the needs of local government revenue losses was about $3 billion between now and FY23, and that number was likely an understatement. It's not just OSPB and policy who are fighting for you as well. The controller is constantly asking the Treasury for more guidance and more understanding. Finally, I want to just get to this last point of revenue replacement. Under current Treasury guidance, CRF may not be used for revenue replacement. The House and Senate both passed stimulus bills that would allow the CRF for revenue replacement, and we've been advocating for this to be included in any final bill. Revenue replacement is the underlying issue we are hearing from local governments. We've hammered this point home in our calls with our senators, congresspeople, and those in the executive branch. Just for your awareness, the Senate introduced a skinny bill of their stimulus. It does not allow CRF to be used for revenue replacement. We're fighting against this. I'm going to pause right there before we turn back to the matter at hand, which is the current CRF allocations and the current guidance around that. But I just wanted to emphasize this point because we don't always talk about it, but we are fighting for you. Next slide, please. So the goal of our current CRF allocation is to safely spend 100% of the federal funds in Colorado, returning 0% to the feds. We can only do this if we are giving consistent guidance across the state. Next slide, please. This is one of the frequently asked questions from the Treasury Guidance. The governor's office wants to protect us all from an audit. OSPB and the governor's office is already being audited for their allocations of CRF funds. We're constantly reading Treasury Guidance to ensure this does not happen to any of you. We're trying to avoid the Treasury from taking back our funds. Next slide, please. So how do we determine eligible expenses? It's not just local governments that are asking us these questions. State agencies are also asking how they can safely spend the CRF. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of money went to K-12 and higher ed. Local governments have been submitting questions to DOLA on CRF, and I highly recommend that everyone on this call continue to do so. State agencies are also submitting spending plans for CRF allocation. K-12 and higher education are submitting questions on how they can spend their CRF funding. OSC and OSPB have weekly calls about this guidance, trying to update it when new information comes available and trying to find nuances and understanding in some of the guidance. OSC and OSPB have also submitted many questions to the Treasury for clarification. We have not received answers as of today, August 20th. OSC joins calls from the Office of the Inspector General to understand reporting and audit guidance to ensure that what we're doing in the governor's level is correct, and to also make sure that, again, none of you have to be audited the same way we're being audited. OSPB also joins weekly calls from the White House to get updates on CRF. And I just want to say we have worked with DOLA and OSC to answer over 70 questions from locals, which is more than the US Treasury has answered in their frequently asked questions. Next slide, please. And I just want to emphasize, I know it's baseball season and it's not the same if you can't go to in-person games, but I just wanted to end with this quote from Babe Ruth. We want to be partners with local governments in delivering essential services to all Coloradans, and we are hearing you and advocating for you. Along with DOLA, OSPB, and OSC, as I mentioned earlier, have answered over 70 questions posed to us from local governments regarding CARES Act. And I'm about to kick it off to our partners at DOLA to walk through some of these answers, but I just want to read out loud. The way a team plays as a whole determines its success. You may have the greatest bunch of individual stars in the world, but if they don't play together, the club won't be worth a dime. And with that, I'm going to give it over to Chris and Tamara.
Yeah, I think actually Tamara.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, this is Tamara Norton. Chris and I are going to tag team the next section of this presentation. I do want to remind folks to please continue to put your questions in the chat. We have folks on the back side of things to get you an answer. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We want to start with something positive. Pet adoptions are on the rise and drive-in movie theaters are making a comeback. Those are two positive things that are due to COVID-19. So with that, we're going to jump into things. If you could go to the next slide, thank you. Navigating expense eligibility. So the best way we can help you be strategic is to help you understand eligible spending and the categories where spending can occur. The guidance from the Treasury is changing constantly, and we are doing everything we can to make sure that we are reviewing those changes on a regular basis. But this presentation is based off of what we know to be true today. The important takeaway is to spend these funds as quickly as possible in eligible categories that we're going to talk about. Next slide. The CARES Act has three primary purposes of how spending can be done. The first one is expenses must be necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19. 2, were not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27, which is the date of the CARES Act. And 3, were incurred during March 1st through December 30 of 2020. Next. So just to dive into each of these three purposes quickly, the Treasury Guidance does detail a little bit more about each one. The first one talks about necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency, and that means expenditures must be used for actions taken to respond to the public health emergency, and that an expenditure is reasonably necessary for its intended use in the reasonable judgment of the government. Next. Second, regarding costs not accounted for in the budget most recently approved, there are 2 tests. The cost cannot lawfully be funded using a line item, allotment, or allocation within that budget, or the cost is for a substantially different use from any expected use of such funds. Next. And then third, regarding costs incurred for the period between March 1st and December 30 of 2020. For a cost to be considered to have been incurred, performance or delivery must occur during the covered period, but payment of funds need not be made during that time. That is updated guidance from the Treasury dated June 30, which is a slight deviation from what we had when the CARES Act was enacted. If an agreement for services is in place, require delivery on or before December 30. Next, please. We have 6 categories in which eligible spending can occur. The first one is medical. We have public health, payroll, compliance measures, economic support, and other. So Chris and I are going to take you through each category, some high-level information about each category, and then Chris will address a frequently asked question for each category. Next. That first category of medical expenses. These are examples including COVID-19 related expenses of public hospitals, clinics, and similar facilities, related expenses of establishing temporary public medical facilities and other measures to increase treatment capacity, including related construction costs, costs of providing COVID-19 testing, including antibody testing, related emergency medical response expenses, including emergency medical transportation, and related expenses for establishing and operating public telemedicine capabilities or related treatment. Next.
Yes, this is Chris LeMay, North Central Regional Manager. As an example of a question, one that you might want to consider is under the medical section, questions come about whether or not a local government can provide a grant to a hospital using the Corona Relief Fund money. And the answer is yes. And in fact, we do have local governments, hospital and health districts whose entities were eligible to opt in under the special district allotment specifically. But also of note, a local government may also grant money to a hospital as well, and that can be a private hospital. And that in the instance where, initially we were facing some capacity issues, those hospitals incurred some expenses and could potentially be reaching out to local governments to assist. I also wanted to point out, it's not on the slide, but the cost of testing is an eligible expense. And I know that some of you may have been on some calls yesterday and are hearing now that the CDPHE is able to, the state lab is now turning tests around in 2.1 days. So with the turnaround in the testing times, there's some encouragement there that this can be a critical tool to ensure that we are able to slow the spread and reopen or remain open. Next slide.
So the next category is related to public health, and examples include expenses for communication and enforcement by local governments of public health orders related to COVID-19, expenses for acquisition and distribution of medical and protective supplies, including sanitizing products and PPE for medical personnel, police officers, social workers, and other public health or safety workers in connection with the COVID-19 emergency. Expenses for disinfection of public areas and other facilities in response to COVID-19. Expenses for public safety measures undertaken in response to the public health emergency. And expenses associated in contract tracing are also eligible. Next slide, please.
Yeah, again, as an example, the CDPHE has announced that they've got Protect Our Neighbor Infrastructure Strengthening Grants in the amount of $150,000. It does require a 50% match. Question's been asked whether or not the Corona Relief Fund dollars could be used as a match, and the answer is yes, and encouraged. The challenge, again, there is a timing issue there because the CDPH money did come through the CARES Act as well, and so it needs to be spent by December 30th, 2020. I think this example also serves as an example of leveraging other resources, and the idea that you may be able to stretch your dollars a little bit if you mix and match your funding sources. Again, public health, rapid testing platforms and test reporting data infrastructure, which can increase speed at which cases and outbreaks are identified and slow the spread, are eligible under public health. Next slide.
The next category is regarding payroll, and payroll for expenses for public safety, public health, healthcare, human services, and similar employees whose services are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID public health emergency. Next slide.
Again, the local public health agencies have identified that something that would be really beneficial at this point is to help staff up for critical need. And this includes positions from planners to contact tracers, translators, case investigators, and what have you. Of course, those are all eligible expenses. You are able to hire new staff members if they weren't in your budget as of March 27th. And those salaries would be considered eligible expenses. Next slide.
The next category is regarding compliance, and there are examples such as expenses for food delivery to residents, including senior citizens and other vulnerable populations, expenses to facilitate distance learning, including technological improvements in connection with school closings, expenses to improve telework capabilities for public employees, and related expenses of maintaining state prisons and county jails, including sanitation and improvement of social distancing measures. Next slide.
Yes, so a common question we've received, could an organization purchase computer equipment for the employees so that they can work from home? Is that considered an eligible expense? And the answer is yes, those dollars, if they weren't accounted for in the budget, and you weren't planning on buying computers and you needed to go out and get new laptops and VPNs in order for your employees to work from home. And those of course were purchased after March 1 and prior to December 30th, those would be considered an eligible expense. Next slide.
So the next category is related to economic support, and examples include expenditures related to the provision of grants to small businesses to reimburse the costs of business interruption caused by required closures, and unemployment insurance costs related to the public health emergency if such costs will not be reimbursed by the federal government pursuant to the CARES Act. Next slide.
So under economic support, there's been a couple of questions related to providing a business or individual assistant loan program. And this gets a little tricky. And again, you need to consider the timing because any amounts that are repaid by the borrower before December 30th must be returned to the Treasury, or you have to expend those on another eligible expense. Anything that's not repaid after December 30th would need to be returned to the Treasury. And so you might want to consider options of grants rather than loans. And of course, these costs do need to be, the loan, any money loaned out would have to be for COVID related expense. Next slide. Another example of a question around the economic support is may a local government make payment to a nonprofit organization to dispense services to a business or an individual? And again, you can use a nonprofit to distribute your assistance. Has to be related to COVID-19, of course. Documentation, can't tell you enough to document. And because you're giving it to a nonprofit does not mean that we simply need to see the check that was given to the nonprofit. You need to ensure that the nonprofit is spending those dollars by December 30th, 2020, and also maybe asked to provide some backup documentation that the nonprofit spent those dollars on COVID-related expenses. Next slide.
So the last category is related to other, and that's any other COVID-19 related expenses reasonably necessary to the function of government that satisfy the fund's eligibility criteria. Next slide.
Yes, so a common question has been, may funds be used for capital improvement projects? And the answer is, in general, no. If the capital improvements are necessary expenditures incurred to the public health emergency, then the fund payments may not be used for such projects. However, if they are temporary in nature, and for instance, temporary public medical facility or other measure, those could be, dollars could be used for those purposes. Additionally, some further guidance from the State Controller's Office provides that they need to be temporary and they shouldn't be incurred for items that have a useful life of greater than 1 year. Next slide.
So we have a relatively short list, actually, of ineligible expenditures provided by the U.S. Treasury, and that includes expenses for the state share of Medicaid, damages covered by insurance, payroll or benefit expenses for employees whose work duties are not substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID-19, expenses that have been or will be reimbursed under any federal program that equals duplication of benefits, and that is not permitted, reimbursement to donors for donated items or services, workforce bonuses other than hazard pay, severance pay, and legal settlements. Next slide. So to wrap us up with something else that's positive, population levels have dropped and board games and puzzles are cool again. Something that's happened that's positive in 2020. Next slide. So we have a bunch of resources available for you on the CVRF website. I do encourage you, when you are considering how you want to spend funds, all of the resources that our regional team and all of the DOLA staff use on a regular basis to help identify if spending is eligible are all available to you on that CVRF website under a resources link. It's all of the Treasury Guidance and the Q&A log. So we research the same thing that's available to you there and encourage you to reach out to that website. If you have questions that you just can't locate the answers to, we encourage you, you can reach out to your regional manager or whomever you've been communicating with currently. But we do have a CVRF email address that is set up that you can email questions to that will be checked throughout the day, that we will be responding to questions. That's dola_DLG_CVRF@state.co.us. So last thing before I wrap up our presentation here, I do want to make sure we're clear when when folks are submitting their reimbursement requests for spending for the CVRF program, it's important to take note of two things. We do ask that you provide enough detail in the description so that we can clearly understand what was spent and how it was spent so we can determine eligibility. We also ask that everyone be sure that you're reporting in the correct category. So the reimbursement form is separated out into spending categories. For example, we need to make sure that everything that is a medical expense is not listed in other. We have to report information up, and we want to make sure we're telling the right story of where spending is occurring. So with that, I am concluding the DOLA portion of the presentation, and we'll turn it over to our hosts.
Oh, okay, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box, and we will attempt to get those answered as we go through the Q&A session for the next few minutes. And we've got a few that came in during the presentation. Let me see if I can pull that up.
I'm happy to.
First question we have is I'm sorry, are you ready?
Oh, go for it, Chris. Yeah, you got it. Thanks.
Will we be reimbursed under this program for distributions made to individual citizens impacted by COVID-19 impacts that are not already covered by some other government program? Audrey, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So the answer to that is yes, if a government determines such assistance to be necessary. Assistance should be structured to ensure as much as possible with administrative feasibility that the assistance is necessary and related to the impacts of COVID-19.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add too is with the aid to the individual citizens, you know, I've had a couple of questions, people saying, can we essentially give all of our utility customers a credit on their water or sewer utility fees? And the guidance is that that would not be permissible. It needs to be based specifically on COVID related expenses and impacts. Now, you could give your individual person that's impacted by the COVID-19 a grant. That does not prevent them from paying a utility bill, but be cautious of crediting an account with a utility payment, because there is also language about that being a revenue that you could have recovered. All right, I got another question here. Will we be reimbursed under this program for distributions to businesses impacted by COVID-19 impacts not already covered by some other government program? If they do it based on some distribution algorithm based on an objective, measurable metric by the municipalities, such as the sales tax revenue and net income loss for 2020 impact period over the 2019 baseline period. Audrey?
Yes, so the answer is yes, governments have the discretion to determine what is necessary to structure the program. But note that grants to businesses must be claimed as gross taxable income and all funds must be distributed by December 30th, 2020.
And kind of a follow-up to that one, or actually this is more in line with the first question. If distributions to individual citizens are allowed and not already covered, if we calculate distributions based on some equitable distribution, again, I think you have to be careful with that equitable language, and that you need to ensure that they actually have impacts from the COVID, and you don't just provide everybody, like the federal government did, the stimulus dollar that you received. I've got a question here. It says safely, thank you for this. Is it possible to walk through what we are planning to request for reimbursement before we submit? Audrey.
Sure. We're encouraging you to connect with your regional manager to discuss broad, specific reimbursement requests. But if you have a question that you haven't been able to find on the Treasury Guidance, definitely reach out to us. You can also email us at the email address that Tamara provided in the slideshow.
Okay, I've got a question from Peter Gibbons, City of Longmont. Where can we see the Treasury Guidance changes directly? I'm interested in seeing the text and where those releases are being made. And again, that information, yeah. Go ahead, Audrey, sorry.
Yep, we on the Coronavirus Relief Fund website, which we will put that link in the chat, you can find the most updated U.S. Treasury Guidance under the resources section.
This is Tamara. I will add to that the Treasury does not keep all of their past guidance. They simply replace the link. So all that's available on the websites are what's currently in place, the most recent update.
Yeah, and I think in the last update, there is a little footnote that you can look at that tells you what change was made to the August 10th version. We got a question from Christy Crosser. We have already expended over our allotted amount. Some we feel more comfortable with than other expenses. Should we plan to get our submittals in now? Audrey?
Yes, as soon as you're ready to submit your reimbursement request through the portal, please do. We're currently receiving and reviewing requests now.
And then a follow-up question. Yep, we are ready to receive reimbursements in the portal. Sorry, that wasn't a question. That was answering your question. Andrea, please share information on eligible building enhancements and capital expenditures. I heard somewhere that it can't have a useful life of more than 1 year, but not sure. I think in our presentation, there was some reference to the useful life not being greater than 1 year and that they needed to be temporary. So I hope that answered your question. Another question from Andrea, can funds be given to the local hospital for purchase of a new ventilation machine?
So yes, fund payments can be used to support hospitals to the extent that costs are necessary, expenditures incurred due to COVID-19.
I would want to remind folks to make sure you are ensuring there's no duplication of benefits. So no additional other funds, federal funds coming from another agency for the same purpose.
Ashley Higgins asks, do agencies receiving pass-through funds need to follow the same 3 guidelines as the local government, i.e. incurred due to public health, were not included in the budget, and between March 1 and December 30th? Who wants to answer that?
Yes, all expenditures must follow the same guidelines regardless of if they're passed through or not.
Brian Devine is asking, does this include local public health agency staff overtime not included in a 2020 budget? And if it wasn't included in your budget and it's a health-related expense, those would be eligible. Bernie Block asks, with regards to grants to hospitals or other nonprofits, can you briefly discuss subrecipient monitoring requirements that will apply? Who would like to ask?
So as a primary grantee, you're responsible for ensuring dollars you subgrant to meet the expectations of funding use. You should maintain records, determinations you make on file for all subgrantees so that you can share proof of alignment should you be questioned later as to your determination for funding.
All right, Andrea again. Can we reimburse for police officers who are already budgeted but are spending a good portion of their time on response?
So yes, as long as their time, 51% or greater, is substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID-19.
And then Andrea's got another question. Can we reimburse, can funds be used for payroll of employees during the time they are quarantined?
The location of employees conducting work is not part of the determination factors related to these dollars. It's again, substantially dedicated work to mitigating or responding to COVID-19.
All right. Peter Gibbons again, comment, not question. Tamara, that portion about what we should provide was very useful. Good job, Tamara.
Thanks.
He's requesting if we could put those in a table and send out as a slide, that the packages might come in with more clarity. Just a suggestion there. Christina McCrea, is the COVID sick and FMLA that was granted to government employees a qualifying expense?
The statute requires.
Go for it.
Okay. The statute requires that payments be used only to cover costs that were not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27th, 2020. As stated in the guidance, a cost meets this requirement if either A, the cost cannot lawfully be funded using a line item, allotment, or allocation within that budget, or B, the cost is for a substantially different use from any expected use of funds in such a line item, allotment, or allocation. If the cost of an employee was allocated to administrative leave to a greater extent than was expected, the increased cost of such administrative leave above what was budgeted may be covered using payments from the fund. This includes sick leave related to COVID-19.
All right.
Chris, this is Tamara. If I could address Peter's comment. We will be emailing all of the recipients of the CVRF dollars to make the same statements that we talked about today regarding detailed description and reporting in the correct category. We'll also make sure we get something up on our website to help with clarity. So thank you for that comment.
Looks like we got another question on regards to payroll costs. If they're working more than 51% to support COVID-19, would they be allowable? Yes, I think we've answered that one. I got a question from Peter again. How will DOLA and the U.S. Treasury define reasonable and necessary and responsible as stated throughout the Treasury policy guidance? If 100 staff organization needs 100 laptops for telework, is it reasonable? Does 101 become reasonable or some? I didn't see the rest of that. You want to take a stab at that one?
This is Tamara. There's currently no further definitions regarding reasonable and necessary and responsible. So it is up to the local government to make those determinations.
Got a question. Can we make a second request for funds if we have eligible reimbursable expenses in excess of the first request?
This is Tamara. There are no additional funds available, so you can request up to the allocated amount that was provided to your local government. If you have exceeded that allocation at this time, you can wait for information to come out about the reserve funds at a later date. But there's no additional funds to request at this time.
Andrea Phillips again, are variable message boards expenses to provide public information reimbursable? I think as long as those meet the guidelines that, you know, March 1st, purchase after March 1st, between December 20th, weren't in your budget, that would be considered a reasonable expense to communicate those information to your public related to COVID. If anybody else wants to add to that, they can. Got a question on what about loss of penalties and interest? I'm not sure whether those are eligible expenses.
We might need a little bit more clarification on that question, and then we can follow up in an email with a response.
Yeah, and if we don't get to all these questions, we will follow up with you and also try and prepare a spreadsheet that summarizes some of the information. Got a question, would it be possible to do a screenshot of an example of the description and layout of information you want in the reimbursement portal? This would help us all know what you're looking for.
We can see what we can come up with. There are certainly a lot of different ways to report. We really need to be able to sit in front of an auditor and say with a straight face that we were able to determine that something was eligible because the description provided enough detail. It doesn't have to be multiple sentences, but it needs to be more than 2 words, for example. But just do the best you can with providing enough description so that we can understand what the funds were spent on.
Okay. Got a question. Is it much of the discussion is governmental reimbursements? Can you speak on businesses, i.e. a movie theater, restaurant, and business with continued restrictions to business capacity? I think you're looking for some examples of reimbursements that would be eligible. You know, I think one thing that you'll see in the guidance is reference to have there been other federal sources of money to assist the businesses, and so that's something to be cognizant of if they've already received some of the money through the PPP and the business loan programs. Then you might want to verify that before you provide them a grant. Again, you know, the costs are intended to be for expenses related to the COVID pandemic. So I think there is some ability to recoup some costs that they had in order to open their businesses to enable clientele in their physical facilities. Joel, not sure if this was originally went through. If a nonprofit is used to administer a grant program, do we need to follow procurement guidance in CVRF 200? Who wants to tackle that one? I think just real quickly, you know, the procurement guidelines, you might be able to go back if you declared an emergency declaration. You may have had the opportunity or included some language in there as it relates to your procurement policy, or those may be included in your response and recovery plan as part of your emergency management plan. But my understanding is that if you follow your own procurement policy, that those would be the document that you would be using as guidance as it relates to the nonprofit. Anybody, if I misspoke, somebody could feel free to step in. What's the best way to document that an employee has been substantially dedicated to COVID response? For example, a Muni Court employee that has been repurposed to human services for a COVID project. Who would like to answer that?
I'll answer that. So timesheets and anything else the local government used to communicate those new duties, such as an updated position description, agreement, contract, etc. That would be something that we would look for. No need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to understand how you've identified the employees who've been repurposed.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Another question from Brittany. Our city is doing a portion for residents who were affected by COVID. What kind of documentation do we need to get from them, have on hand to show that they were affected, and then do money to be spent on COVID expense, or can dollars go towards rent, food, etc., that they were no longer able to afford because of COVID? I think if you're going to be doing individual assistance, I would, I would probably handle it the same way a lot of communities are handling the business assistance, in that they're asked to fill out some sort of application, and I would have them, and I mean, you can go as far as creating check boxes that says it's for this purpose. Just make sure that those purposes are COVID related, or you can have them fill out the document themselves. I would just suggest that you have some backup that demonstrates that that they are indeed COVID related. Can we submit several reimbursement requests up to our allotted funds, or just one?
Yes, you may submit several reimbursement requests.
And we're taking those up to what date? Is it December?
Chris, this is Tamara. So yes, they can submit as many reimbursement requests as they need to. We can only have one in flight at a time. So one must go through all levels of approval before another reimbursement request can come through. And currently, all of the allocation agreements with our CVRF recipients expire January 31st. So funds have to be spent by December 30, but those reimbursement requests could come through through the end of January for reimbursement.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. We got a question. If we submit a reimbursement request for expenses through June 30th, but later discover in our second quarter expenses that may have been omitted, can we include those in subsequent reimbursement requests?
Yes, to the extent that the relevant government official determines that these expenses are necessary and they meet the other requirements set forth, then yes, you may.
So I think this is kind of a follow-up to the question on penalties and interests. Municipality lost out on over $13,000 from March to July in penalties and interests on customers not paying utilities. Are those eligible?
That's a really good question. We're actually going to get back to you on that one. That's a little bit tricky. So Tammy will reach out to you.
And then can we use these funds to pay for temporary modifications to allow social distancing in the workplace, i.e. plexiglass, temporary walls, network connectivity to a new temporary workspace?
Yes, as long as these modifications are temporary and can be removed when they are no longer needed due to the pandemic. But these are great examples of temporary installments, plexiglass, temporary walls, and also network connectivity for people.
Okay. Well, we're coming to a close. We've got about 4 minutes left. Wondering if someone was going to do closing statement, or Marguerite, do you want to inform of the other CRO events and such?
Yes, thank you, Chris. I was just looking for my unmute button. So the next webinar we have is in 1 week from today at 1:30, is actually part of the broader small communities workshop discussion. So we're encouraging, obviously, all small communities to join, and we'll be talking about the current update that we're doing to our state resiliency framework, and we would love your engagement. We are at the engagement period of that process, and so we'd love to hear your perspective and feedback on our current priorities for the state. We'll also talk about some local resiliency planning resources that we have, and we'll be using a framework planning process that we did with La Plata County as an example. And we'll also be talking about some of our COVID-19 recovery takeaways specific to small communities. And if you're interested in our following webinar after that, we are working with CDPHE, the Office of Emergency Preparedness and Response, on a behavioral health conversation, and that's on September 3rd. It's our normal Adaptations and Futures webinar time from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. So thank you all for the really great questions. We were able to get to almost every single one. We read off every single question. We did not necessarily get to answer every single one in full. So we will be following up with the recording of this event, a copy of these slides, some of the answers to your questions that weren't answered, and we're looking forward to staying in touch and seeing all that you do with your funds. So thank you again to all of our panelists, from Ashley, from OSPB, Tamara, Chris, Audrey, Rachel, everyone who's in the back answering questions very quickly. It's very appreciated. So thank you all for the gratitude in the comments as well. We had a lot of thanks out there, so we're thankful for all of your work too as our local government partners. So with that, we're going to close the webinar. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your week.